Welcome to the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, where I cover topics and issues that will help you take a stand for Christ in culture. More than ever, followers of Jesus need courage to stand up, speak up, and to live out their faith, because people need to know that there's a God in heaven that loves them, and it is His truth that sets people free. Thanks for listening today, and I hope that you enjoyed the episode. Hey, thanks so much for joining us on the Courage Over Cowardice podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Frank Turek. He's an American apologist, author, public speaker, and radio host. He's best known as the founder and president of a Christian apologetics ministry known as crossexamine.org. He's co-authored a number of books, and we'll be talking about one of those in particular today. Great man of God, love his stuff. He was recently at Freedom Life. It was absolutely fantastic. Dr. Frank, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Sam. Great being with you as always. And I love being at your church, by the way.
That's fantastic. Well, I want to jump in and I want to talk about some of these really important topics that we see that are happening culturally. I found, and one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is because there is a lot of confusion and cowardice within the context of the church. Well-meaning, moral people that are seemingly confused on topics that I don't think we should be confused on, but I think it's important to lean in, talk about them. What does God's Word have to say about that? And I so appreciate your ministry and apologetics. So maybe just for those that maybe they weren't at Freedom Life, not around, they're not familiar, maybe just talk for a few moments about your ministry, what you do, and apologetics doesn't mean apologizing. So go ahead, fire away.
Yeah, we have a ministry called crossexamine.org. That's cross-examined with a D on the end of it.org. That's our website. We have a YouTube channel with like 1,600 videos on it. Most of them are from the college campus because we go to college campuses and we present evidence that Christianity is true from a book I co-wrote a number of years ago called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So we give evidence that Christianity is true. Then we take questions on the college campus, high school campus, churches, wherever we go. And we provide evidence. We also have a podcast called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, a TV show by the same name. So we're trying to disseminate what's out there, the evidence that's out there for Christianity, and we're trying to answer objections against it. We also have a pretty big social media presence, not because I know how to do that, because I have a great team that puts all that stuff up. I've never put a YouTube video up in my life, but they know how to do it. So that's what we do, Sam. We're not apologizing in the sense we're saying we're sorry. The word apologetics comes from a Greek word that's found in 1 Peter 3:15, which is about giving an answer, giving a reason for the hope that you have. That's what it's about.
Yeah, genius. And I want to encourage everybody to check out his website, YouTube, follow him on Instagram. There's a lot of great resources that you can just share for people with just good biblical answers, sound that are going to help them grow in their faith or make decisions ultimately for Christ. And so I saw you put out an updated version of a book, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about it on this podcast and just go through some of the different issues that you covered. Could you tell us a little bit about that book, the name of the book, why you wrote it, and then we can get into some of the content?
Back in 2008, I knew that the issue of same-sex marriage was a big issue, and the church couldn't really respond to it, at least chose not to respond to it. So I actually wrote a book called Correct, Not Politically Correct, How Same-Sex Marriage Hurts Everyone. Now, this is not a book, actually, that quotes any Bible verses. It's a book that's just giving the natural law, medical evidence, reasons why same-sex marriage is not good for individuals and not good for the nation. I updated the book after the Supreme Court decision that imposed same-sex marriage on all the states, imposed same-sex marriage on the country. Back in about 2016 or 17, I updated the book. And then just this year, just a month or two ago, I updated the book again. It's the third edition because transgenderism is now the big issue. So now the title of the book is Correct, Not Politically Correct, about same-sex marriage and transgenderism. Again, this is not a book that you have to be a Christian to agree with. It's a book that if you're open to reason and evidence, hopefully you'll realize that although same-sex marriage and transgenderism may be well-intended, it actually turns out in the long run not to be good for individuals or the country.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant. And so jumping right in, the question was, why not legalize same-sex marriage? So maybe we can start there. We can go through the other issues, but start there with that New Jersey accent. Come on,
Forget
somebody.
about it. Well, actually, there are a number of reasons, and obviously we can't cover them all. They're all in the book. But the biggest problem by saying that same-sex marriage is equivalent to what we call natural marriage, marriage between a man and a woman, is essentially you're making marriage genderless, Sam. You're saying that
Yeah.
gender has no bearing on marriage at all. Well, if gender has no bearing on marriage at all, then what institution is designed in our country to take care of children? Marriage is supposed to be an institution that is not just about romantic affinity, but it's supposed to be the institution that takes care of children.
Yeah.
And if gender has nothing to do with marriage, because now it doesn't matter whether you marry a man or a woman, doesn't matter what you are, then children are an afterthought in marriage. And actually, it wasn't the LGBTQ community that predominantly brought us same-sex marriage and genderless marriage. It was actually the heterosexual community. Why? Because a little over 50 years ago, we bought into the notion that marriage is just about romantic affinity. It's just about whether I have feelings, romantic feelings for somebody else. It wasn't built around marriage is essentially about children. It's essentially bringing people together to perpetuate and stabilize society. In fact, that's why the government has been involved in marriage, Sam, is because the government realizes that when a man and a woman come together and procreate, that's the way they can perpetuate and stabilize society. When you break down the biological two-parent family, all of society gets sick. And we've seen that over the past 50 years. So what's happened is we've said as heterosexuals, gee, I just don't have these feelings for my wife anymore. So I deserve to move on to another person because I'm not in love anymore. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you really think about this logically, that makes no sense at all. Why? Because when you take a vow on the altar of marriage, you're not vowing to feel a certain way for the next 50 years. You can't do that.
Correct.
You can't vow to feel that you're going to like the other person for the next 50 years and feel good about the person for the next 50 years. You might as well say, I'll never vow to be hungry or angry again. You can't do that. In fact, you wouldn't need a vow if you always felt good about the other person, right? You wouldn't need a vow. You need a vow when you don't feel good about the other person. When you wake up in the morning and you go, you again, right? You go, oh no. That's when you need the vow, Sam. You see, vows are about keeping you in the relationship when it's hard. And you need to stay in the relationship when it's hard. Why? Well, if there are children, certainly. But secondly, that's how you grow. That's how you become selfless. In fact, Gary Thomas, from a Christian perspective, put out a book a number of years ago called Sacred Marriage. And the subtitle of the book is really all you need to read. Now, the book is good, but I'm saying the subtitle says it all. What if God created marriage more for our holiness than our happiness?
Yeah.
I mean, think about that. If you just bail on a relationship whenever it gets hard, not only are you a creep, but secondly, you're not becoming more like Jesus. And if you want to leave Christianity out of it, you're not becoming a better citizen, because what you're doing is you're leaving kids, you're leaving someone who is dependent on you. You've walked away from your commitments, and that doesn't make you a better person. It makes you a shallower person. It makes you a more selfish person. Now, we could talk more about this, but again, you don't need the Bible to know this. So that's the problem. One of the problems, the reason we got, to complete the thought, the reason we got same-sex marriage is because heterosexuals said marriage is just about romantic affinity, and I can leave my spouse if I'm no longer in love anymore. Well, if a man and a woman get to do that, if it's all about romantic affinity, why not two men or two women? It's just the inevitable outcome of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's we see the effects that it's had on our nation, on children, on family, the outworking of that in a very short period of time.
Yes.
And that's why, I love the title of the book, because about legislating morality. In the past, I heard someone say, you can't legislate morality. And, early on, I was younger, I heard that and I adapted it. I didn't really think deeply about it. It was just a way to, not focus on political hot button issues and to stay just teaching the scripture. And foolishly, for me, not seeing how devastating it is when Christians cede the public square and are not involved politically. And so maybe we could talk about that for a few moments. Should Christians be in politics? And if so, how should they be in politics?
Well, let's go back to your first assertion there, and I've heard it so many times, you can't legislate morality. Turned out that was the first book I co-wrote with Dr. Norman Geisler, and it's called Legislating Morality. It's really creatively titled. The point is that all laws legislate morality. Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. The only question is whose morality will we legislate? Yes. And I don't want to legislate my morality. And I don't want to legislate your morality, Sam. I want to legislate the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul said the Gentiles don't have the law written on their hearts. Look, everybody knows the morality. We call it self-evident morality. You know right from wrong on the big issues, regardless of whether you know the Bible or not, because God has written it on your hearts. And this is how Jefferson started the country. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And governments instituted among men to secure these rights, not to give rights or take away rights. They're to secure rights. You don't get your rights from government. If you got your rights from government, that would mean a new government could come in, change their mind, and take rights away from you. No. Rights don't come from government. They come from God. So all laws legislate morality. The only question is, whose morality should we legislate? And if we're Christians, we should care enough about our fellow man that we want the right morality legislated. In fact, I just asked two questions for people who don't think we ought to be involved in politics, Sam. These are the two questions. First question, should Christians care how people are treated? I mean, what Christian's going to say no? Of course, we're supposed to care how people are treated. Second question, should Christians care how people are treated by their government? Well, yeah, if you care how people are treated, you should care how people are treated by their government. Okay, now you're in politics, right? And another reason we have to be involved, not only to love our fellow man, because how do you love people politically? You put laws in place that protect innocent people from evil. That's what you do. And you don't put laws in place that promote evil. Laws like some in our country now that are promoting evil, like transitioning children or preventing proper counseling for kids that are going through this thing. Those are evil. Or having sanctuary states for abortion. That's evil as well. You're killing people there, okay? We want to have laws that prevent innocent people from being hurt. And then secondly, I always tell people, because you hear pastors say this, and you and I both are friends of Charlie Kirk and TPUSA, and we realize that what he's saying is true with regard to this, and that is that Christianity is affected, as all religions are, by what the political forces do. And I always ask people, if you don't think, because you hear pastors say, oh, I just preach the gospel, I don't get involved in politics. To which I respond, if you don't think politics are important, you don't think the gospel is important. Why? Because politics affects your ability to preach and live the gospel. If you don't think so, go to some of the countries I've been to. I've been to Iran. I've been to Saudi Arabia. I've been to China. You can't have this podcast in those countries, Sam. You can't have your church in those countries, Sam. You can't preach the gospel freely in those countries. You can't. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. So for no other reason we have to be involved politically is to protect our ability to preach and live the gospel. Not to mention we ought to love people by making sure their government doesn't do evil to them, or at least their government prevents evil from being done to them.
Yeah, no, that's so good, so well said within that. So one of the accusations when churches, pastors, leaders, Christians decide that they're going to make their voice heard, they're going to fight for the morality, as you said, which is all truth is God's truth. And the accusation is you're just Christian nationalists. Maybe you could talk a little bit about Christian nationalism. I know it's kind of a broad term that's used however someone wants to beat up another person with it. But from your perspective, kind of define that and maybe equip us a little bit in defending ourselves, because that's meant as a pejorative in a sense to silence us. What do you have to say about that?
Well, it's the same question I ask whenever somebody says something. I don't try and refute what they say. I try and ask for clarification. So if they say, hey, you're a Christian nationalist, I'm going to say, what do you mean by that? What does
Yeah.
that mean? Unpack it for me. Because as soon as they try to unpack it, they're going to be in trouble. Because if they say, well, you just want your view imposed. Well, don't you want your view imposed? Of course.
Yeah.
We have competing views, and we're jockeying in the public square to see if we can get our views imposed. That's what everybody's trying to do. Everybody's trying to legislate morality. Second thing I might say to them, after they try and define Christian nationalism, which they probably won't be able to define it clearly, as you just said, it's a pejorative. It's trying to get you to shut up. The second thing I want to say to them is, if they say, well, you're trying to establish a theocracy, I'll say, what do you mean by theocracy? Okay. If it means that I want people to worship a certain way and come to a certain church or mosque or whatever and be a member there and do certain rites and rituals, no, I'm not trying to do that. In fact, I know very few people in the public square that are trying to impose religion. We're not trying to impose religion. We're trying to impose morality. And everybody's trying to do that. Look, religion has to do with our duty to God. Morality has to do with our duty to one another. We're not telling people where, when, how, or if to worship. That's legislating religion. But we can't avoid telling people how they ought to treat one another. That's legislating morality. And everybody's trying to do that. Atheists are trying to do that. Christians are trying to do that. And everyone in between. So we're not trying to impose a national religion. We are trying to impose a national morality, but that's what all laws do. So we're all on the same playing field. The only question is, do we have grounds for our moral position? Because if you're an atheist, you don't have any grounds. You're just saying you want this imposed. Look, there's only two ways to govern, Sam. You can govern by principle, or you can govern by power. In other words, you can govern by what you think, by what is really right, the principle that is correct, that comes from God, the morality that says you have a right to life, for example. You can govern by that, or you can, if you don't have that, you can only govern by power. I'm just gonna crush you. I'm just gonna try and shut you up. I'm just gonna try and beat you because I want my personal view imposed. I don't want my views imposed, actually. I mean, they are my views, but when people say don't impose your morals on me, I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that abortion's wrong, that rape is wrong, that theft is wrong, that men were made for women and women were made for men. And the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society is to legally recognize that man-woman relationship over every other relationship. I didn't make any of this stuff up. This is not my morality. This isn't your morality. This just happens to be the morality. So I'm not trying to impose my invented worldview. I'm trying to impose the worldview that our founders recognized, that they wanted morality and moral rights without having a religion that everybody had to adhere to. They wanted religious freedom, but they knew they couldn't have anarchy moral freedom. They knew there had to be certain rules in place so people wouldn't hurt one another. And that's basically what morality is.
Yeah. No, very good. Kind of within that, I was thinking about this particular issue. I wanted to talk about a couple different issues. We're going to get into transgender ideology, but I wanted to talk about boundaries and borders because I think talk about it as far as our nation is concerned. But I think it's a great way to frame or talk about these issues that we're going to dive into in just a few moments related to the transgender ideology, because boundaries and borders, I would say, are biblical. We live in a nation where the new terms or idolatry, I would say, misplaced feelings. We use the term empathy, which you got to, I know, explain a lot of that. But so many things are thrown into. You need to empathize, and if you empathize, then you need to understand, like, people have to come to our nation. So we have a border crisis. We've had one for many, many years. It's gotten progressively worse, and turmoil all over the nation, worse in some states than others. And some on the left, in particular, the progressive Christian crew that would say, you know what, you just need to love people. We need to bring them in. Maybe talk about for a moment, because I heard you address this before, and I thought it was really helpful. Why should we have borders? Why should we have those things in place? And why is that actually loving your neighbor? So go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, the Bible presupposes private property. Thou shalt not steal presupposes that property is not communal. There are borders. And for people that say they don't believe in borders, I say, do you have a lock on your door? Of course you do, right? Everyone believes in borders. They may just disagree on where the border is, okay? And it would be impossible for you to invite everybody in the world into your home, right? If you did that, and you said you can do whatever you want, your house would be destroyed in short order. The same thing is true with a nation. As much as we would like to give people the opportunity this nation affords them, if we literally invited everybody to this country, we couldn't maintain the system that we have here. It's much better to say, well, here's our system. Let me share it with you. Maybe you could put it in place where you live. Okay.
Yeah.
Take a look at this, because the United States is like 5% of the world's population. If you didn't have a border around the United States, which is what we're kind of seeing now, we have all sorts of trouble. Not only do we have too many people coming in, what we have are drug trafficking, terrorists coming in, we have sex trafficking. I mean, we have so many problems coming across the border that we can't even keep the people in this country secure from evil, because people are bringing evil over the border. Yeah. And so borders are necessary. Sure, we want to have a certain level of immigration, but we want to have immigration where the country can control immigration, just like you might have immigration into your home, right? You'd let certain people in and other people you wouldn't, okay? Because you have to maintain order inside the home. You also have to maintain order inside the country. And if you just open it up completely, you'd have anarchy. And that's kind of what we're seeing on the border right now. And this goes back many years ago. There was a guy, Charles Krauthammer, who used to be a commentator for the Washington Post and also for Fox News. And when President Obama, Krauthammer's passed on, but when President Obama was the president, they were talking about a wall on the border, and Obama said walls don't work, and Krauthammer said, then why is there one around the White House?
Yeah.
I mean, come on, of course. It's the same people who say, well, we should have no guns. Well, wait a minute. These are the same people that are hiring personal security, people with guns. Why? Because this is a world full of people who have an inclination to do evil. You need protection, and that's the difference between the left and the right, in my view, Sam. The left doesn't realize. The left thinks that people are inherently good, whereas the right realizes, no, people are inherently evil. If you don't put certain protections in place, you're going to have trouble. And not to get too far afield, but this is why defund the police was the dumbest political idea of the past 5 years. Sure. Because if you take away the police, you've taken away the foundation for an orderly society. If you don't have law and order, you don't have a society. You don't have economies. People can't risk their capital because they're afraid it's going to get stolen. So, I mean, there's 1,000 reasons we need borders. Yeah.
I think it's the danger of us being led by our feelings.
Yes.
And not ultimately the word of God, truth, rational thought, our poor philosophy. And when you think about, I wanted to bring up that idea, and I appreciate you talking about that with borders, because legislating morality, we say, well, you know what, we need to allow same-sex marriage. We need to allow, and then it just continues on. And now, as you said in your last update of your book, we have what's called transgender ideology. So maybe talk about that for a few moments. What is that? What's happening? What do we need to be aware of?
Well, about 4 years ago, Dr. Michael Brown and myself debated two representatives of the LGBTQ community, and it was a debate. I think the title was something, does love require affirmation and approval? Something like that. And they were, of course, saying, yes, if you got to love me, you got to approve what I do. And of course, Michael and I were saying, no, you don't have to approve what you do to love us. And so at one point in the debate, I asked the other side, I said, do you love us? And they said, yes. And I said, do you approve of our position? And they said, no. And I said, well, you've just lost the debate then, because that's our position. You can love somebody and not approve of what they do. And every parent knows this, right? I mean, if you're a parent and you approve of everything your 11-year-old wants to do, are you loving? No, you're unloving. Love does not require approval. And as Paul famously said in 1 Corinthians 13, the passage that everyone reads at their wedding, but nobody obeys, He says, love always perseveres. Love always protects. Love rejoices in the truth. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing. If you're going to love somebody, you have to protect them. You have to stand in the way of evil. You have to say, no, don't do that. I'm going to stand in the way because I love you. And so same-sex marriage may sound well-intended. Transgenderism may sound well-intended, but its results are not good. And if you love people, you'll stand up and say, no, this is not good for you. So when it comes to the transgender issue, there's so much to talk about, but let me just say that both cross-sex hormones and surgery have been shown not to be effective, not to solve the psychological mismatch that someone has between their psychology and their biology. The suicide rate, Sam, for people that actually get the so-called transgender surgery is 19 times higher than the general public after the surgery. Okay? Wow. It does not, and there's a honeymoon period where they feel better, but about the 10-year mark, everything goes haywire. And people realize that they've mutilated their bodies. They realize this does not work. And let me just say a couple of things about transgender ideology to show you how contradictory it is. On one hand, transgender ideologues will say gender's fluid. On the other hand, they have to presuppose it's not. Why? Because if I'm a man and I think I'm a woman, I have to have some idea what a man is and some idea what a woman is to know I have this mismatch. If there was no fixed gender, if there was no fixed man or fixed woman gender, there'd be no way for me to know I had this mismatch, right? Yeah. Secondly, if I try and make the so-called transition, which of course is biologically impossible, you can change your mind, you can't change your biology. But if I try and do that, I have to have some idea what a man is and some idea what a woman is to make the so-called transition. So on one hand, transgenderism is trying to say that there are no fixed genders. Gender is completely fluid. On the other hand, it must presuppose there are fixed genders. Otherwise, transgenderism would not exist. There's no reason to try and transgender if you don't know the difference between a man and a woman. So it's not a logically coherent viewpoint. And in fact, there's even a bit of a civil war inside. And I document all this in the book, Correct, Not Politically Correct. Inside the transgender or the LGBTQ so-called community, there's a bit of a civil war. They're not really a community. Why? Because if the T's get their way, that there are no genders, the L's, the G's, and the B's don't exist, Sam. Because if there are no genders, how can you be lesbian, gay, or bisexual? You can't. Lesbian, gay, and bisexuality presupposes genders. Okay? Whereas transgenderism says they're not. And by the way, the feminists aren't too happy with this either. Why? Because if there are no genders, there are no women. And if there are no women, there are no women's rights. And this is why J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, has stood firm. She says, you're erasing women. You're erasing women by saying transgenderism is the thing, that men can become women. No, you're erasing them. You're taking away their rights. You're taking away their privacy. You're taking away their safety because you're allowing biological men into women's sports and women's restrooms and locker rooms. This is madness, and it is.
Yeah, it is. And we see it's going even further where it's not just, hey, we don't just want adults to do this and manipulating adults, but now targeting children and very young children. Maybe talk about your thoughts on that for a moment.
Yeah, that is the most sinister thing of all, unfortunately, Sam. And I want to just go to a point in the book. The book's called Correct, Not Politically Correct, because I want to read to you what the United States government put out on March 31st, 2022. This is this is from the Health and Human Services, Biden's Health and Human Services Division. It's a sub-organization of HHS. And let me find the exact quote because it's really hard for me to believe they actually put this out, but they did. First of all, here's what they say. There is no scientifically sound research showing negative impacts from providing gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming care is when you, even as young as 3 years old, say, if you're a boy and you think you're a girl, okay, you're really a girl, okay? Yeah. First of all, that statement that they just made there is demonstrably false, okay?
Yeah.
Because at that point, there hadn't been done much research on this issue because we don't experiment on children, right? But since then, there has been research that come out that has said this is not a good thing, okay? Yeah. But Sam, do you really need to know that you ought not mutilate a child's body because they say they're a woman and they're really a boy. No, you already know that anyway. Anyway, here's what the statement goes on to say. This is from the United States government, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not making this up. The decision for the child welfare system to become involved in the lives of families, potentially to the extent of removing children from their families and homes, should be wielded with the utmost care, grounded in evidence, and always prioritizing the well-being of children and preservation of families. Now, do you know what that really means? What they're saying is that you, as a parent, if you don't affirm your child's gender, if you have a little boy that's 7 years old and he thinks she's a girl, and you don't affirm him as a girl, the United States government may come and take your child away from you. Mm-hmm. And I'm not making this up. This is why Rod Dreher, the conservative columnist, said this. He said, that HHS statement ought to send a chill down everyone's spine. The Biden administration is laying the policy groundwork for the seizing of minor children from parents for the sake of jacking those children up with hormones and mutilating their bodies with surgery. This is all documented and correct, not politically correct, about same-sex marriage and transgenderism. But you can probably go find that. It's still out there. It's an HHS directive from March of 2022 on so-called Trans Visibility Day. Now, this is madness, ladies and gentlemen. When the United States government is claiming that they have the right to come take your child from you if your child is confused. That's what they're going to do.
Yeah, it's so awful. I heard Charlie Kirk say this the other day, and I thought it was interesting. We don't take people who think they're that are anorexic, that think they're not skinny enough, and give them liposuction and say, there you go. We try to treat them. We try to help them. And it is absolute madness that we're seeing from our government. And I think kind of goes in line with why we need to be involved politically in the public square, and ceding our responsibilities to people that actually believe this stuff, which is demonic. Let me ask you this question: is civil disobedience ever justified? And if so, what would that context be? Because people get outraged to say,
of course it's justified. Just look at the book of Daniel, or look at the apostles. We must obey God rather than men. And there's two reasons for civil disobedience. One is when the government tries to prevent you from doing something God told you to do, like preaching the gospel. And the second is when the government tries to force you to do something that God says don't do, like, say, aborting your children or transitioning your children, right? Yes, you'd civilly disobey. Now, that doesn't mean you're trying to overthrow the government, except through the means we can do so here in this country, and that's through fair elections. And I wonder if we have those anymore. But no, yes, civil disobedience. Now, that means you're going to disobey, but you're going to have to take the consequences. You may go to jail. You may get fined. Okay, fine. But you're not going to sit back and tragically, I'm not condoning this, but this is going to happen if this goes further, Sam, that if the government comes into some guy's house and tries to take his little girl or little boy away from him, there's going to be shots fired. Okay. Yeah. People are you're not coming into my house and taking my child from me to give her or him cross-sex hormones or mutilate their bodies. You're not going to do that. Yeah. People are going to say, sorry, not happening. And that's going to be a tragic event. Yeah. And by the way, what Charlie said there actually goes back to what Dr. Paul McHugh from Johns Hopkins University many years ago, when he was at Johns Hopkins, they used to do transgender surgeries. And he was one of the ones that said, don't do it anymore because you're actually feeding a mental disorder. And then they, of course, went back to doing them again. And he used anorexia as the illustration. And there's other illustrations, too. I mean, obviously, if your daughter says she's overweight when she's really anorexic, you're not going to give her a liposuction. If your daughter came to you and said, I'm a mermaid, would you take her off the coast and drop her in the ocean? Of course not, right? You're going to say, no, honey, your mind is playing tricks on you. We need to get you counseling. There are people out there running around now, Sam, who are saying they're disabled when they're really not. Like in their mind, they think they shouldn't have an arm. So would you take, would a doctor then cut the arm off because the guy thinks he's disabled or the person? No, that would be ridiculous.
Yeah.
You don't fix a mental disorder with surgery. You fix a mental disorder with psychiatry, with prayer, with counseling. You don't fix it with surgery.
Yeah. Yeah. We live in those days, and it really goes to if you don't believe that God exists and you have no foundation for morality, then it comes down to opinion. Choose this day who you will serve. I think of Elijah when he said, if Baal is God, then serve Baal. But if God is God, then serve him. And we're in that place where we're seeing the outworking of Baal worship, or this demonic worship, the worship of self, the worship of demonic gods and ideologies. And, within that, I wanted to talk about for a moment the existence of God. You give an acronym called the SURE acronym, S-U-R-E. And there may be some listening to the podcast that you're like, well, I don't really know. And I was just wondering if you could take a few moments and just kind of unwrap that a little bit, maybe point people to some resources that you have.
Yeah, well, the SURE acronym is a way of showing that the universe had a beginning. And if it had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. And scientists are admitting now that space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing, even atheistic scientists. And one of the ways we know this is through this SURE acronym. And the S stands for the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the universe is running down. You can think of the universe as, say, a dying flashlight. If you were to take a flashlight, put new batteries in it, turn it on, and leave it, and come back the next day, what would the strength of the beam be coming out of the flashlight? It'd be very weak, if not dead. Why? Because you only have so much juice in those batteries, right?
Yeah.
Well, would there be any light coming out of that flashlight now if it had been turned on an infinitely long time ago? No, right? It'd be dead now. Well, this is showing that the universe had a beginning. Why? Because we still have light here. The sun is still burning. So it must have had a beginning. If the sun had been burning from all eternity, it would have burned out already. We'd have no energy left. It's like we're basically saying the universe has a finite tank of gas. Okay.
Yeah.
And so, like, if you're driving your car from all eternity, you would have no gas now. Okay. But since it still has gas, you must have started driving it recently. Well, that's one way we know the universe had a beginning. The U stands for the fact that the universe is expanding. Edwin Hubble discovered this back in 1929 at the Mount Wilson Observatory outside of Pasadena, California. He noticed all the galaxies were moving away from us. Well, he just deduced that if you went back in time, you would see all the galaxies collapse back to a point actually of nothing, of infinite density. So once there was nothing, and then the universe came into existence and rushed outward. And that's what many call, of course, the Big Bang. The R stands for the radiation afterglow. That's the initial heat from the Big Bang explosion, or the remnant heat, I should say, from the Big Bang explosion. This was discovered in 1978 by two scientists. Actually, it was discovered in 1965 by two scientists at Bell Labs in Homedale, New Jersey, not too far from where you are right now. They won Nobel Prizes for it in 1978. And what they discovered was basically the smoking gun to the creation event, the smoking gun to what we call the Big Bang. The heat is still out there. They discovered it. And the E stands for Einstein's theory of general relativity, which says that space, time, and matter are correlative. They came into existence together, which means you can't have space and time without matter, and vice versa. They all came into existence together. And Einstein realized this way back in about 1916, but he didn't really believe it until he saw the expanding universe that Edwin Hubble discovered back about in 1929. Then he realized that his initial general relativity calculations were correct, and therefore the universe had a beginning and time had a beginning. And if time had a beginning, what could have created time? So we always ask the question, if space, time, and matter had a beginning, what could have caused that? Only something outside of space, time, and matter. In other words, only something spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create, because to go from a state of nothingness to a state of creation, only you have to make a choice, and only persons can make choices. And of course, intelligent, to have a mind to make a choice. So we always ask people, Sam, when you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause, who do you think of? And most people will say God. But then they'll say, well, how do you know it's the Christian God? And the answer is we don't yet. We have to do more research. This one argument, which is called the cosmological argument, may show that there is a being out there like God, but we don't know if it's the Christian God. This could be Allah or some other theistic God. But if you do enough research and realize that Jesus rose from the dead, which is what we do in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, then we can say that the same being that walked out of the tomb 1,990 years ago is the same being in whose divine nature created the universe out of nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're sure of that because of the second law, universe expanding, radiation afterglow, and Einstein's theory of general relativity.
Wow. I love that. It's fantastic. You brought up that point. And when we know that God exists and that God has created the world in a certain way, that then there's laws that govern the universe. There's laws that govern our world. There are laws that govern our lives that make the world a predictable place. And then we understand that politics and the laws that we have in our country, that they all have an impact on us as well. And one of the things that you said, we had mentioned earlier, I think before the podcast, and coming back to this transgender ideology and the madness that we're seeing, where things continue to devolve away from truth and reality, where we're thrown off the shackles of, as we would say, religion or just thinking. You said where it's headed is pedophilia. Why do you say that? And just talk about that for a few moments. I agree with you completely on that, and I think we're in a dangerous time.
Well, back 15 years ago, when I had just written the first version of Correct, Not Politically Correct, an FBI agent contacted me via email, and he had written a book. And he had written a book because he had gone undercover with NAMBLA. You know what NAMBLA is? North American Man-Boy Love Association. These are the pedophiles. So he'd gone undercover, this guy. And in the book, Correct, Not Politically Correct, I talk about how one of the justifications for same-sex behavior has been, well, we're born this way, right?
Yeah.
And of course, there's answers to that. We're all born with an orientation toward bad behavior. That doesn't mean the behavior is a good thing, right? I mean,
yeah.
We're living a fallen world and we're fallen. So yeah, we have many desires we ought not act on. There's a difference between attractions and actions. And just because you have an attraction doesn't mean you ought to act on it. I mean, no person in the LGBTQ community would say it's okay to gay bash if you have the anti-gay gene, right? Yeah. You know, you'd say, I don't care how you're wired. You can't do that evil thing. All right.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what this FBI agent said to me was, in undercover with these people, you know what their justification was? We're born this way. That was their justification. We're born to have this affinity for children. And so if we want to have sex with them, sorry, we're just born that way. And that's where this is heaven, because if there is no limiter, if there is no line that can't be crossed because there is a God, then you're just going to use power to get what you want. And people are going to use every sympathy in the world to try and condone what shouldn't be condoned. Because as you know, Satan comes as an angel of light. Notice, Sam, that all of the words that are used to describe what is really evil are pleasant sounding words. It's love, it's equality, it's reproductive justice, right? It's choice. It's all the words that are good words. And, who could be against justice, or who could be against equality, or who could be against choice, or who could be against love? All those words don't mean what you think they mean, but they're used to try and get you to take a sugar-coated poison pill, because that's what they are. It's sugar-coating poison. That's how Satan works.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it just triggered, made me think about the social justice movement, and how it is kind of hand in glove with some of these things that we're talking about, because, we need to free these people. They need to have equality under the law. What's the problem with the social justice movement, and how does it differ from biblical justice?
Well, we should have equality under the law, but we shouldn't have equity by law. That's the difference.
Yes.
Because equality is the law treats everyone the same. Equity is the law is going to take from one and give to the other, regardless of how they got there. In fact,
Yeah.
I've been thinking about a definition of woke. It seems to me a definition of woke is to ignore behavior and try and equalize people based on their identity group. That's what it is, basically. It's
Yeah.
as Charlie Kirk has said, Marxism is a ideology of conflict, because there's always an oppressor and there's always and someone who's oppressed. And the goal here is, even if you're not personally oppressor, if you're in the oppressor group, the goal is to take from you and give to somebody who's in the oppressed group, even if they aren't oppressed. As Rod Dreher has pointed out, I think in his book, Live Not by Lies, the crazy, I mean, there's so many crazy things about this, but one would be that a white Christian homeless man living on the streets is an oppressor, but a black feminist lesbian Yale professor is oppressed.
Correct.
By this kind of logic. Okay. So basically what you're doing is you're treating people based on their identity group, not based on their qualifications or their behavior. And you are unjustly taking from others to try and give to the people who are just in this identity group. And that's, first of all, that's unjust to begin with. Secondly, you're never going to get rid of the conflict. There's always going to be conflict. It's the anti-Martin Luther King policy. Martin Luther King said, I have a dream that one day my 4 children will be able to be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And this whole new movement is exactly the opposite of that, Sam.
Yes.
And by the way, there's so many corporate elites out there who are now promoting this. In fact, you've heard of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Well, they've actually added one. And it's kind of cool, actually. It's JEDI. Have you heard of this? JEDI? Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's from a galaxy far, far away. Anyway, a friend of mine was at a conference. He was filming a conference here in Charlotte for an architecture firm. And the CEO got up and said, we're really for JEDI. We're for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I said to him, I wish there was someone there who raised their hand and said, sir, does your secretary make as much as you do? Oh, she doesn't. Well, you don't believe in equity then, do you? You believe in justice. You notice that justice and equity are opposites? Justice says you get what you deserve. Equity says everyone gets the same. So which one are you going to pick? This is a contradictory worldview. We're for equal opportunity. We're not for equity, because equity means you're taking from some people unjustly and giving to other people unjustly. So it's not biblical justice. In fact, the Bible even says, do not favor the rich or the poor.
Yeah.
So, and Jesus, he's the ultimate non-Marxist, because what does he say about the parable of the talents? The one guy that hides his talent, what happens to him? His talent is given to the guy who has 10 already and has actually done something with it. That's not equity. That's justice. The guy that did something with it is going to get more. The guy that didn't, that buried it, isn't even going to keep what he has. So Jesus is not one of these social justice warriors. He's not trying to equalize everything. He's saying you're going to get what you deserve.
Wow.
Take what I've given you and use it for God's glory, and you'll get rewarded for it. And if you don't, what you have is going to be taken from you.
Wow. Yeah, that's so good. Thank you for speaking to that, because I think it's so important. We're told the opposite within culture. We're being groomed to believe, and grooming the next generation to believe the opposite. And I think it would have the implications are very concerning. If you would, as we kind of bring this together, there's so many things that I'd love to include in this. I'm not going to hit on all the topics, because you have an excellent podcast that I want to recommend to everybody, where you hit topics ranging from scientific evidence for the resurrection to free will or Calvinism. Which one should you choose? Answering questions about how to stand for Christ in a collapsing culture, the 5 flaws of transgender ideology. There's so many different topics. I think you do such an excellent job of covering and giving giving real tools and real answers that are useful. So I want to encourage everybody that's listening to this to check out the resources that Dr. Frank and his team put together. But if you could just encourage everybody, as we talk about legislating morality, believing in God, that we need to be active in the public square. We need to have our voices heard because we believe that ultimately we want the truth, which is God's truth, to rule and reign, because we love our neighbors and we want to honor the Lord. If you just, as we bring this together, what would you encourage and suggest that the person that's listening to this podcast, all different types of people are listening right now, what can they do to start saying, you know what, I want to put this into practice? If we can legislate morality, we can make a difference. I want to do that. So what are some things that would you recommend for them to get started?
Great. Yeah, there's 1,000 things you can do. In fact, that's how we end the new section of the book, Correct, Not Politically Correct. Because a lot of people are discouraged, Sam, as you know. Oh, gee, this is just crazy what's going on. And I'm just one person. What can I do? In fact, some will say that. And what we say here is actually quite a bit. There are many things you can do to restore our culture to sanity and inform and protect people in your circle of influence. You can pray, read, speak, write, post, volunteer, teach, counsel, vote, and run for office yourself among 1,000 other things. And since you're never going to be more than one person, you might as well get busy now, right? In fact, if you think about what's happened throughout history, every accomplishment in history, for good or evil, has been achieved by individual persons working toward a goal. And our job is to do what's right and leave the results to God. You may think it's hopeless. It doesn't matter whether you think it's hopeless or not. You just do what's right and you leave the results to God, because part of doing what's right actually enhances your soul, right?
Yeah.
Rather than just sitting on the sidelines going, oh, woe is me. Look, it's better to light one candle than curse the darkness. So do something and leave the results to God. That's if everyone did that. In fact, think about this. We even in America today, all these issues, whether it's, you just pick your issue, whether it's same-sex marriage, whether it's transgenderism, whether it's abortion, whether it's divorce, whether it's the poor, whether it's whatever it is, whatever issue that Christians have to be concerned with. If every Christian just acted like a Christian should act, most of our political problems would be over.
Yeah, very good.
Because you would vote that way. You might even run yourself instead of what happens today, where about half the Christians don't even vote.
Yeah.
If Christians just voted and voted biblically, Christians would dominate politics, which means that people that they loved would have laws in place that would actually be beneficial to them. Even if it's the law they don't like, it would be beneficial to them. Yeah.
Very good. So good. Well, I just want to say thank you for being on the podcast today. Thanks for your ministry and all that you do. As you guys are active all over the nation in all different sorts of environments, it's an encouragement to I know us, our church, and to so many. And really enjoyed having you on. I can't wait to have you back at Freedom Life in the future. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks for you and Michelle and your entire team there. It's much harder being a pastor than being a Christian apologist. I'd rather deal with atheists than elders any day, so you're the man.
Thanks, brother. Love you.
All right, same here. Love you. See you.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope this message has inspired you to courageously stand up, speak up, and to live out your faith. If you like what you heard today, give me a 5-star review, follow the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, and share it with others to learn how to stand for truth in the midst of culture.